Her cry cracked through the desert night like a wounded hawk falling from the sky, a sound so jagged it felt like it could tear the fabric of the silence, a sound too heavy for the thin, cold air. This wasn't the sharp cry of a new wound. No, this was the sound of 1,000 old wounds splintering open at once, the final, shuddering release of years folded tightly into her chest. It was the sound of a woman who had been invisible for so long she had started to believe she was a ghost. Her name was Alara, and at 55, her hair was streaked with gray like the remnants of a storm cloud. She sat by a dying fire, the embers glowing like tired orange eyes, and she whispered the words that had become her truth, her mantra, her cage. The words tasted like ash on her tongue. I am too weak to be loved. Once, she hadn't been this way. Once, she had been fire. A girl whose laughter was a wild thing that tangled with the rush of the river. A girl whose hands knew the language of weaving, of carving, of healing. But time, like a slow, deliberate river, had weathered her down. It had turned the fire into something the world saw as brittle, useless wood. The first man she ever gave her heart to, a boy named Marcus with eyes as bright as a summer sky, had been the one to carve the deepest scar. He didn't use fists. He didn't use knives. He used words, and they were sharper than any blade. He called her a burden. He said she was too proud for a woman, too old for real tenderness, too hollow for a man's desire. And because he was the first, and because his leaving felt like a final judgment, she believed him. She believed every single word. So she built her life not as a home, but as a fortress. Her days were filled with hard labor, and her nights were filled with a silence so profound it had its own weight. She raised 2 children who grew into polite strangers, their eyes always fixed on some brighter horizon she could never be a part of. One by one, they walked away, and the silence they left behind was even heavier than before. She tilled the dry earth, but it gave her little in return. Her palms grew thick with calluses no one ever thought to kiss. She carried water from the well, and each bucket felt like she was hauling the weight of every rejection she had ever known. The people in the small town nearby, they whispered. They called her the old Apache woman, the one who lived alone, the one time had forgotten. She heard their whispers, but she never answered. She just folded their judgments into that same dark place in her chest where she kept her tears, deep down where no one could see them. But the body, it always keeps the score. Sorrow isn't a thought, it's a physical thing. It lingers in your bones. It pools in the weary muscles of your shoulders. It trembles in your throat right as the sun goes down. And on this night, sitting by the fire, she just couldn't contain it anymore. She covered her face with her hands, the skin rough as bark, and the words slipped through her fingers like smoke. Too weak to be loved. The fire's glow painted her cheekbones in a tired copper light, but even the flames seemed to shrink away from her despair. She leaned closer to the dying coals, listening to their faint hiss, as if they were whispering back to her, telling her it was futile to burn when the world had already decided you were extinguished. The vast desert around her breathed in and out, a slow, indifferent rhythm. Coyotes yipped in the distant hills. The wind combed through the sand. It didn't care. There were some who saw a flicker of the truth in her. An old healer woman, her face a road map of wrinkles, once took her hand and said, "You are not ash, little sister. You are an ember." But Alara had just shaken her head, unable to believe it. A young ranch hand, shy and kind, greeted her every week at the market. He called her ma'am and gave her a small, respectful smile. But she always looked away, convinced his kindness was just another word for pity. Their small gestures were like hands pressed against the stone wall of her fortress. They reminded her she was still part of the living world, but she couldn't find the door to get back in. Loneliness isn't always a roar. Most of the time, it's a quiet, constant weight at the base of your spine, as steady and reliable as gravity itself. She carried that weight into every sunrise. She carried it into the market, where she watched young couples brush shoulders and laugh. She carried it into every twilight, when the stars spread across the sky and refused to answer her silent, desperate prayers. She just endured. Endurance was the only art she had left. But tonight, that art failed her. Her endurance finally cracked. Tears carved clean tracks down her weather-beaten face, and she let them fall freely into the dirt. Each drop sank into the dry earth, as if it were feeding something hidden deep below, though she didn't know it. Her confession, her deepest shame, rose like a frail offering to the wide-eyed heavens. Too weak, too late, too forgotten. Her chest ached with the finality of it. This was it, she thought. The last threshold, the final unraveling of hope. She pressed her palms flat against the earth, wishing she could just dissolve into it, become one with the dust and the silence. No one had ever waited for her. No one was ever going to arrive. The desert seemed to agree. It answered her with a silence so vast, so complete, that her own breathing sounded like a trespass. Even the fire sighed and dimmed, as if it was reluctant to bear witness to such a quiet death of the spirit. She felt herself fading, dissolving into total insignificance. And then she felt it. A tremor. It ran through the ground. A vibration felt more in her bones than heard with her ears. It was subtle at first. She stilled, her breath catching in her throat. She wiped her wet face with the back of her hand and listened. The sound grew. It was measured, steady, undeniable. Hoofbeats, the cadence of a single horse crossing a great distance. It wasn't in a hurry. It wasn't wild. It was deliberate. Her heart gave a single, startled thump against her ribs. It's nothing, she told herself. Just a traveler passing in the night. A shadow that would soon vanish. But the rhythm of the hoofbeats kept coming, pulling her out of her despair. It sounded like an echo from another lifetime, a memory she had long since buried. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, trying to shrink back into the dark. But it was too late. From over the ridge, a silhouette emerged, perfectly framed by the moonlight. A lone rider. He was broad-shouldered, weathered, a man who looked like he'd been carved from the trail itself. He didn't rush toward her. He guided his horse with a quiet certainty, his presence both familiar and utterly unknown. He halted his horse a short distance from her fire, dismounted with a slow, careful grace. And then he just stood there. He stood for a long moment, just watching her. And his gaze was so intense, it felt like a physical touch. He looked at her, as if the sight of her, broken and crying by a dying fire, was something sacred. Her throat closed up. The fire between them suddenly flared, a fresh lick of flame reaching up as if stirred awake by his arrival. His silence wasn't empty. It was filled with a kind of reverence. And though he hadn't spoken a single word, she felt seen, truly seen, for the first time in decades. The feeling was so powerful it both terrified her and unmade her. The whole desert seemed to hold its breath. She clutched the shawl tighter, the whisper coming to her lips one last time, fragile as breaking glass. Too weak to be loved. And then, as the last echo of the hoofbeats faded into stillness, she looked into his eyes and saw a truth that shattered her despair into 1,000 pieces. He wasn't a stranger. He was a man she had glimpsed once, on the very edge of her life, a lifetime ago. A man who now carried the weight of decades of waiting carved into every line on his face. The desert wind swept between them, carrying the scent of sage and dust and something else, something that smelled like destiny. She couldn't understand why he had come, not yet. She didn't know what the promise in his eyes meant. But the silence between them was no longer empty. It was charged, heavy with the ache of unspoken years. As the fire leaped higher, casting their two shadows long across the sand, she knew, with a certainty that shook her to her core, that her story had just changed forever. Something she had buried long ago had just stirred back to life. And as the cowboy stood there, motionless, as if carved from the night itself, he finally spoke. His voice was low and steady, and it wasn't what she expected at all. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask if she was okay. He looked right at her, his eyes holding a universe of secrets, and he said two words that changed everything. "It's Marcus." The name hit her like a physical blow. Marcus. The boy who had called her a burden, the man whose memory was the foundation of her fortress of loneliness. But this wasn't Marcus. This man was older, his face a roadmap of harsh sun and harder miles. He was broader, rougher. He was not the boy she remembered. She stared at him, confused, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The man saw the disbelief in her eyes. "My name is Silas," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Marcus was my brother." Brother. The word hung in the air between them, heavy and strange. Marcus had never spoken of a brother. He had painted himself as an orphan, a lone soul fighting against the world, which had made his abandonment of her feel all the more absolute. She felt a cold knot of suspicion form in her stomach. This man, Silas, had watched her from a distance. He had waited until she was at her most broken to approach. Why? "What do you want?" she asked, her voice raspy from crying. Silas took a slow step closer to the fire. The flames illuminated the deep-set sorrow in his eyes. "I'm not here to take anything," he said. "I'm here because of him. I'm here to tell you the truth." He told her that Marcus hadn't just left her. That was a lie, a carefully constructed lie their father had built. Their father was a powerful, cruel rancher who owned half the valley. He saw Alara, a proud Apache woman with no family and no money, as a stain on his family's legacy. He had forbidden Marcus from seeing her. "Marcus refused," Silas said, his gaze fixed on the fire. "He told our father that he loved you, that he was going to marry you, and that he would give up his inheritance, the ranch, everything, for you." The story felt like a fairy tale, a beautiful lie designed to soothe an old woman's pain. But Silas's face was etched with a grief so profound it had to be real. He told her about the last night he saw his brother. Marcus had packed a small bag. He had a document in his pocket, a deed, Silas said. He was coming to her that night, to give her the deed to her ancestral land, which their father had been trying to buy up for years. He was going to ask her to leave with him, to start a new life far away from his father's shadow. "But he never made it," Silas whispered. "He and my father had a final, terrible argument. I was there. I heard the shouting." Silas's voice cracked. "The next morning, my father told me Marcus was gone. He said he'd run off, ashamed. He said Marcus left a note saying he never wanted to see any of us again." Silas looked up from the fire, and his eyes met hers. The pain in them was a raw, open wound. "My father made me swear to never speak his name again. And he gave me a job. He told me to watch you, to make sure you never came looking for answers. He said it was for your own protection, to keep you safe from the trouble Marcus had stirred up. For 35 years I've watched you. I've watched you raise your children, watched you grow old, watched you carry a pain that wasn't even yours to carry. It was mine." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. He held it out to her. Her hand trembled as she took it. Inside, there was a single, heavy object. She poured it into her palm. It was a silver locket, tarnished with age. She recognized it instantly. It was the one she had given Marcus, carved with the symbol of a hawk. She opened it. One side was empty, where a picture should have been. On the other side, tucked into a tiny fold, was a small, yellowed piece of paper. It was a fragment of a letter, the handwriting unmistakably Marcus's. The ink was faded, but she could make out the words. My Alara, he is mad with rage. I fear what he might do, but I will not abandon you. I will come for you tonight. Wait for me by the river. We will finally be. The note was torn off there. This is all I found, Silas said, his voice thick with guilt. I found it in his room weeks after he was gone. My father must have missed it. The truth settled over her, cold and sharp as ice. Her entire life, the story she had told herself, was a lie. Marcus hadn't abandoned her. He hadn't called her a burden. A cruel, powerful man had stolen him from her. And this man, his brother, had been her silent, unwilling jailer for more than 3 decades. The sorrow that had defined her for so long began to curdle, changing into something else, something hot and hard and sharp. It was rage, a clean, righteous rage that burned away the fog of her despair. The fortress she had built around her heart hadn't been for nothing. It turned out there had been a monster outside the walls all along. She looked at Silas, the locket clutched tight in her fist. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice low and dangerous. "Your father. Where is he now?" Silas flinched, but he didn't look away. "He's old," he said. "Lives in the same big house on the hill. He's a bitter, dying man." Alara stood up. The shawl fell from her shoulders. For the first time in years, she stood tall, her spine straight and strong. The firelight danced in her eyes, and she was no longer an ember. She was a flame. "Then you will take me to him," she said. It wasn't a question, it was a command, and Silas, his face a mask of grief and relief, simply nodded. The long night was over. A war was about to begin. The ride to the ranch was a silent one, broken only by the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves against the hard-packed earth. Dawn was breaking, painting the eastern sky in pale shades of rose and gold, but the new light brought no warmth. Alara felt a cold clarity she hadn't known in decades. The world looked different now, sharper, every rock and cactus defined by a new, terrible purpose. Silas rode slightly ahead, his broad back a testament to the weight of the secret he had carried for so long. He was leading her into the heart of the lie that had consumed both their lives. The ranch house came into view as they crested a low hill. It was a sprawling, arrogant structure of dark wood and stone, a monument to a man's greed. It looked like a fortress, much like the one Alara had built around her own heart, but this one was designed to keep the world out, not to nurse a wound. A strange thought struck her. Her children. They had left so easily, so quickly. They sent letters, of course, dutiful and distant notes from cities she couldn't imagine, filled with news of jobs and lives that had no room for her. She had always accepted it as a natural part of life, the quiet, painful shedding of the past. But now, a seed of doubt was planted. Had their departure been as simple as she'd believed? Or had the old man in that house, the architect of her loneliness, somehow orchestrated that too? She pushed the thought aside, one monster at a time. They left the horses tied to a fence post and approached the house on foot. The air was still and cold. Silas walked with the heavy tread of a man returning to his own prison. He pushed open the heavy oak door without knocking. Inside, the house was dark and smelled of dust and decay. It was a museum of a life lived without love, filled with expensive furniture covered in white sheets and portraits of grim-faced ancestors staring down from the walls. In the main room, slumped in a large leather armchair by a cold fireplace, sat a figure. He was a shrunken, skeletal version of the powerful man Silas had described. Old age had stooped his shoulders and thinned his hair, but his eyes, when they flickered up to meet theirs, were still sharp and cruel, like chips of obsidian. This was Silas and Marcus's father. His name was Alistair. He looked at Silas, and a flicker of surprise crossed his face. Then his gaze shifted to Alara, and his lips curled into a sneer of pure contempt. "So," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement, "the ghost finally comes haunting. Did my boy's guilt finally get the better of him?" Silas didn't answer. He stood beside Ilara, a silent, grim statue. Ilara took a step forward, the silver locket cold in her palm. "Where is he?" she said, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. "Where is Marcus?" Alistair let out a dry, rattling laugh. "Gone," he said. "Like I told everyone. The boy was weak, couldn't face his responsibilities. He ran away from you, and he ran away from me." "That's a lie," Ilara said, her voice shaking with a rage that was terrifyingly calm. She held up the locket. "He was coming for me. He wrote it down." The old man's eyes narrowed. He saw the locket, and for a fleeting second, a shadow of fear crossed his face before he masked it with arrogance. A boy's fantasy. He would have grown tired of you, just like he grew tired of everything. "I did you a favor." "You destroyed my life," Ilara said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You let me believe for 35 years that I was worthless, that I was a burden. You poisoned my heart with a lie." "You were a complication," Alistair sneered. "A distraction for a boy with a great inheritance. I simply removed the complication." The sheer coldness of his words, the complete lack of remorse, was staggering. He was a man who saw other people not as human beings, but as obstacles to be removed. Then a new, more sinister thought crept into Ilara's mind. She remembered the doubt about her children. She had to know. "My children," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Did you remove that complication too?" Alistair's cruel smile widened. He seemed to relish this, to enjoy twisting the knife. "They were smart," he said. "Smarter than their father. They understood the value of money. A generous scholarship for the boy, a handsome sum to start a business for the girl. All it cost them was a promise. A promise to build a life far away from here. A promise to never come back and stir up the past." The air left Ilara's lungs. It was a physical blow, more painful than any slap or punch. He hadn't just stolen her love. He had stolen her children. He had carefully and methodically dismantled her entire world, leaving her utterly alone, an island of grief he had created. The rage that had been simmering inside her boiled over. She took another step toward him, her hand clenched so tightly around the locket that the edges dug into her skin. "You are a monster," she breathed. Alistair laughed again, a wheezing, ugly sound. "I am a survivor," he corrected her, "and I protect what's mine." He then turned his cold eyes on his silent son. "And you," he hissed at Silas, "after all these years, you bring her here, you break your promise. You are as weak as your brother was." Silas, who had been standing rigid as stone, finally moved. He looked at his father, and the lifetime of fear and obedience in his eyes was replaced by a look of pure, undiluted hatred. "No," Silas said, his voice low and guttural. "I'm not weak. I'm just done being your coward." The old man's face contorted with fury. He tried to push himself up from his chair, his hands shaking. "You know nothing!" he shrieked. "You think you've uncovered some simple little secret? You have no idea what really happened that night." Ilara froze. There was something in his voice, a manic, triumphant edge that chilled her to the bone. "What are you talking about?" she asked. Alistair pointed a trembling, skeletal finger at Silas. His eyes were wide, glittering with a terrible, last-ditch malice. "Ask him!" he screamed. "Ask your brave protector what really happened. He wasn't just listening at the door, he was in the room. Ask him what he did." Ilara's head snapped toward Silas. A new, unthinkable horror began to dawn on her. Silas's face had gone completely white. He was staring at his father, his expression one of pure agony. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "Silas," she whispered, the name a question, a plea. What is he talking about? Silas looked down at the dusty floor, his broad shoulders slumping, as if the weight he'd been carrying for decades had suddenly become too much to bear. A single tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. He's not lying. Silas choked out, his voice shattering. I was there. The argument. It got violent. Marcus was going to leave, and our father grabbed him. They struggled. I tried to pull them apart. His words came out in ragged, broken gasps. He finally lifted his head and looked at her, and the guilt in his eyes was a bottomless abyss. Marcus fell, he whispered. He fell, and he hit his head against the stone hearth of the fireplace. He didn't get up. The room went silent. The only sound was the frantic, panicked beating of Alara's own heart. Marcus hadn't run away. He hadn't been sent away. He was dead. And Silas, the man who had ridden out of the night like a savior, the man who had carried her memory like an ember. He had been there. He had watched it happen. The fortress around her heart, which had just begun to crumble, slammed back into place, the stones grinding together, thicker and higher than ever before. Alistair let out a triumphant, wheezing cackle. He was so scared, the old man taunted. My brave firstborn, so easy to control. I told him we would tell everyone Marcus ran away. I told him if he ever breathed a word of the truth, I would make sure the sheriff knew that it was his hand that pushed his brother to his death. He's been my dog on a leash ever since. The world tilted under Alara's feet. The man who came to free her was the one who had helped lock the door. The hope he had offered was just the gilded handle of a knife. She stared at Silas, at his broken, weeping face, and she felt nothing. Not rage, not sorrow. Just a vast, cold, empty void. Her great love hadn't been stolen. It had been extinguished, and the man standing before her held the ashes. The silence in that dusty room stretched for an eternity. Alara felt like she was underwater, the world muted and slow. Alistair's triumphant cackling had faded into a weak, wheezing cough. Silas stood with his head bowed, a broken giant, the confession having finally shattered his composure. But Alara felt a strange calm settle over her. It was the calm of the absolute zero at the heart of a winter storm. She had reached the bottom. There was nowhere else to fall. She looked from the pathetic old man in the chair to the weeping son who had been his puppet, and she understood. They were both trapped. Alistair was trapped in his own hatred, and Silas was trapped in his guilt. But she was not anymore. The lies had been the cage, and now the lies were broken. The truth, as horrific as it was a key. She turned without a word and walked out of the house. She didn't run. Her steps were slow, deliberate. She walked past the horses, past the fence, and started walking back toward her home, across the open desert. The sun was higher now, beating down on the sand. Silas came after her. Alara, wait! He called, his voice desperate. She didn't stop. He caught up to her, walking beside her, his face a mess of tears and dust. Please, he begged. I know there's nothing I can say. But you have to understand. I was a boy. I was terrified. He held my life, my brother's memory, in his hands. I did what he said because I saw no other choice. She kept walking. For 35 years? She said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. You saw no other choice for 35 years? You watched me wither away. You watched my children get sent away. And you stayed silent. I thought I was protecting you, he cried. From him, from the truth. I thought the truth would destroy you. She finally stopped. She turned to face him under the harsh, unforgiving sun. What you thought, she said, her voice as sharp as a shard of glass, was that your comfort was more important than my life. You chose to live with a secret instead of facing justice. You weren't protecting me. You were protecting yourself. His face crumbled. He knew she was right. What can I do? He whispered. How can I ever make this right? A memory surfaced in Alara's mind. The old healer's words. You are not ash, you are an ember. An ember doesn't just provide warmth. An ember, under the right conditions, can start a fire that burns everything down to make way for new growth. You want to make it right? She said, her eyes boring into his. Then stop hiding. You can't bring him back, but you can give him justice, and you can give me back what your father stole. A new strength flowed into her, a strength born not of hope or love, but of pure, unyielding will. She knew what Marcus would have wanted. He wasn't just coming to elope with her. He was coming to give her the deed to her land. He was fighting for her heritage. The deed, she said. The one Marcus had that night. Where is it? Silas looked stunned. I don't know. My father would have destroyed it. No, Alara said, a sudden fierce intuition guiding her. Your father destroys people, not leverage. He would have kept it. A document like that, proof that he knew the land was mine, would be a danger to him. He would hide it somewhere safe. Together, they turned and went back. Not to the house, but to a small, dilapidated barn behind it. Alistair was too weak to stop them. He just watched from his chair as they left, his face a mask of confusion and impotent rage. They searched the barn, tearing through old crates and rotten hay, and in a locked box hidden beneath a loose floorboard, they found it. A collection of old legal documents, deeds, and ledgers, and there, at the bottom, was a folded, yellowed piece of paper. It was a legal deed, signed and notarized, transferring the ownership of the 20 acres she lived on, her family's ancestral land, from Alistair's holdings back to its rightful owner, Alara. But that wasn't all they found. Tucked inside the deed was another letter from Marcus. This one was longer, written in a steady, determined hand. He wrote of his father's madness, of his illegal dealings, and his threats. He detailed his plan to give her the deed and run away with her. And then he wrote the last, chilling sentence. If you are reading this and I am not with you, know that my father is responsible for my disappearance. He will not let me have the one thing I truly love. Do not let him win. The land is yours. Your strength is your own. Live, Alara. Live for both of us. Clutching the deed and the letter, Alara felt the last 35 years reconfigure themselves. Marcus hadn't died in a tragic accident. He had died fighting for her. He had known the risks. He had walked into that final argument with his father armed with a plan to protect her, even if the worst happened. He hadn't just loved her. He had honored her. He had seen the strength in her that she had long ago stopped seeing in herself. Suddenly, she knew what to do. The grief was still there, a massive, hollow space in her chest. But it was no longer the center of her universe. Justice was. She looked at Silas, who was staring at the letter with a look of awe and horror. Your brother was a warrior, she said quietly. Your father is a thief and a murderer. You have spent your life caught between them. Now you have to choose. Silas looked up, his eyes meeting hers. The fear was gone. The guilt was still there, but it had been forged into something new. Determination. There's no choice, he said. Not anymore. They walked out of that barn and back into the main house. Alistair was still in his chair. Alara walked up to him and held out the deed and the letter. It's over, she said. Your lies are done. The old man stared at the papers, his face turning a ghastly shade of gray. He had been defeated by the ghost of the son he had destroyed. Silas stepped forward and stood beside Alara. I'm going to the sheriff, he said to his father, his voice steady for the first time. I'm going to tell him everything. What you did, what I failed to do. I'll take whatever punishment I deserve, but you will not win. Alistair opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His reign was over. His fortress had crumbled from the inside out. Alara left them there. She walked out of that house for the last time, got on her horse, and rode away. She didn't look back. She rode home to the small patch of earth that was now, finally, truly hers. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. The story exploded in the small valley. The powerful Alistair, exposed as a murderer and a thief. Silas, confessing his role in the cover-up, his testimony ensuring his father would spend his last few days in disgrace, his empire dismantled. The law was lenient with Silas. His confession, his decades of torment, and Alara's own quiet refusal to press charges against him for his complicity resulted in a suspended sentence and community service. And true to his word, he began his service by working on Alara's land, not as a suitor, but as a penitent. He never asked for forgiveness. He just worked, quietly, tirelessly, honoring his brother's memory by serving the woman his brother had loved. News travels fast. Using the information from Alistair's ledgers, Alara was able to find her children. She sent them copies of Marcus's letter and the deed. She didn't beg them to come home. She just sent them the truth. A month later, 2 cars kicked up dust on the road to her small home. Her children, now middle-aged themselves, with children of their own, stepped out. Their faces were full of a shame and regret so profound it was almost too much to bear. They wept. They apologized. They told her of the money, the subtle threats, the lies they had been told about their mother wanting to be left alone. For the first time, they saw her not as their quiet, sad mother, but as the woman who had survived a war they never even knew was being fought. The fortress around Alara's heart did not vanish overnight, but slowly, carefully, she began to take it down, stone by stone. Her family was back. Her land was hers. Marcus's memory was no longer a source of pain, but a source of strength, a testament to a love so strong it had reached across death to find justice. One evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the desert, she stood looking out over her land. Wildflowers were beginning to bloom in patches, watered by the first rains of the season. She was no longer the lonely woman by the fire. She was a matriarch, a survivor, a legend. Her strength had never been a weakness. It had simply been waiting for the truth to finally catch up. She had found more than just justice. She had found herself again. The story of the Apache woman who brought down a king became a quiet legend in that valley, a tale told to remind people that the desert holds its secrets close, but the truth, like water, always finds its way to the surface. Alara lived out her days on the land she had reclaimed, surrounded by the family she had found again. Her life was not a fairy tale, but something far more real and far more powerful, a testament to the enduring strength of a spirit that refused to be extinguished. If you found yourself moved by Alara's journey from despair to justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You never know what other hidden stories are waiting to be told.